Hi there, welcome to this build of a 48-inch wingspan Tomboy Senior. Now this is a lovely vintage model that was reworked by David Boddington. And David Boddington based it on the 1950s design by Vic Smeeds, which was the smaller Tomboy. Now, in this video we're going to be fitting the servos and the radio gear into the fuselage and getting those control linkages down to the elevator and the rudder. Now, we've done a couple of, just to say, we've got the wings covered in the last video, and also the tailplane, rudder, fin and the control surfaces. Now, in the previous videos we did a couple of essential things to get us to this stage. Now, the one was to fit the rudder assembly, and fitting it in a way that it can be slotted in, and it can be slotted in so it's secure, positive, and the location is repeatable. It's not sloppy. We can just slot it in and take it out, slot it in, and it's exactly the same position as it was the last time we slotted it in. And that's important because when we're going to be installing the servos now and these control linkages to, as I said, the elevator and the rudder, we would then want to be able to dismantle it, take off this assembly and have just the fuselage that we can cover. And then once we've got this covered, we want to again fit this and the linkages in exactly the same position, because we want to get a really precise fitment of these control rods. And the control rods I'm hoping to use, it might change halfway through, I don't know how this is going to go, but the ones I'm hoping to use are 2mm carbon fibre rods. So we'll see how that goes and the process of that. Now, that was the first thing, getting this fitted correctly and securely. That was the first bit of prep we did. Now, in the last video we actually mocked up the whole plane, which is the second bit of essential preparation, and we worked out where the CG was with all the radio gear, and we worked out that actually, as long as we can get everything forward of the indicated CG point, as on the plans that we want to achieve, as long as we get the radio gear, the battery and everything forward of that, we should be able to get this balanced really nice without having to add any nose weight or tail weight. And if we do get the radio gear forward of the CG point that we're trying to achieve, if anything, we're going to end up with a slightly nose heavy plane. And we've got a good sized battery that we can move back a little bit just to fine tune it. So those two actions, which are a video each previously, are really essential to get us to this point. So what I'm going to do now is I'll move the camera and I'll show you how I'm thinking of setting up this radio gear so that we can get it nice and compact at the front of this, this cockpit compartment. Okay, so we're going to install the servos, the receiver and the switch in this area here, forward of the CG point. Now, the CG point, as specified on the plans, I've drawn on here and there in the fuselage cockpit. So hopefully you can see that. So what I'm wanting to do is mount a plate here, a thin plywood plate, probably 2mm, something like that. I'll see what I've got. And I've made myself a paper template just as an indication of size to get the layout right, and that will fit on there. And as long as now we can fit the gear onto that plate that we can then put in, we'll be fine. And when we constructed the fuselage, we did a slot under here, which has got a hole in that for me, you can see, where we can put the battery in, or we can put the battery in from this side, and we can move that up and down to get that fine balance. So I'll show you how I'm going to lay out the gear, the radio gear, so it fits on a plate that we can then just slot in and just maybe 1 or 2 screws to hold it. Okay, so this is the front here and the back here, and we've got the switch crossways, and that's going to be operated from probably a small lever rod that just comes from the switch along and outside the fuselage here, just a small lever. I think that is probably the way I'm going to go, but I'll have another think about that. I don't want to have a switch on the outside of the fuselage here, just because this is a diesel. There's going to be a lot of oil flowing down the fuselage, and I don't think that would last very long. So it's going to be in the cockpit. We've then got the receiver and the two servos, and we can do that quite easily, I think. Plenty of room. It's going to be a little bit tight on the receiver crossways, but I'm fairly sure it is doable. So I'm going to make up this plate now, and then I'll see what plywood I've got, something nice and thin and light, and then we'll see how that fits actually within the cockpit. Right, well, I found myself a nice bit of 1/16 ply, so that's 1.6 mil. So lovely and thin, nice quality ply, and I've marked this out. This is the front, and we've got a slot for the switch. We've then got a space for the receiver and a slot for a couple of servos there. So that'll all fit in there nicely. Okay, so I've got this servo plate in position now, and that's gone well. It's just screwed down at the back here with a hex head sort of servo screw, and at the front let me just remove the receiver. I've put a couple of pieces of balsa on the top to make the thickness of the plate up, so it just wedges under the back of these Beech engine bearers, which I deliberately left just slightly long so I could do that. Now if I take this plate out, it is going to be quite a tight fit when I come to take this in and out, but thankfully it's not something I'm going to be doing every day. So if I get that out, now the servos themselves I've bolted in just 2 mil bolts rather than screws, so I haven't had to thicken this up or strengthen this plate at all. This 1/16 1.6 mil ply is really good, plenty strong enough. Now you can see the cross member here. I hadn't got any spruce which I wanted to use, so this is actually the handle part of a chopstick, so this is actually bamboo, but that'll be resistant to splitting. That'll work fine. So what I'm going to do now is get this plate back in, get it nice and secure, and then I need to get the tailplane fitted and the fin, and then we can start with the control linkages. Right, well, I've now got this servo connected through to the rudder, and that's operating really nicely. It's giving me about 1 inch of throw either way on the rudder. In the build article, David Boddington says 3/4 of an inch is good, so 1 inch should be fine. If I need more or less, I can always adjust it. Now this carbon fibre rod here is not supported at all except for just on this crossbar. I was concerned it was going to be a little bit too flexible, but actually a little bit of flex I think is probably a good thing, because just to cope with the slightly non-linear movement of the servo and also the control horn. Now the control rod, as I've said before, is just this 2 mil carbon fibre rod, and it just goes onto a connector. I've just got this connector here which takes a 2 mil at that end, and I will eventually rough up both these joints and CA that, and then we've got a 2 mil thread here which just goes into a 2 mil clevis like that. So it's a really simple design, and it's a clevis at both ends. It just makes it a lot easier, particularly in the cockpit, for fitting it. If I'd gone with a ball joint, they're quite tight on the threads, and it would make it a little bit more difficult. So that's where we are at the moment, and as I said, it's moving absolutely lovely. What you can see here just there is a little bit of sideways movement, and what I'm going to do is, because I need to cover this and I don't want to just have a hole in here either, I'm going to put a piece of balsa just down the side here, and that will just stop the sideways movement. I'm going to put another piece on the other side, and both pieces will probably come up to this cross member here, and then I'll probably close off the slot about halfway across. So we've just got a short slot here, which restricts that movement a little bit, but it won't impact on the movement because, as I said earlier, this rod is still a little bit flexible. I really didn't know how this was going to pan out, but I'm really pleased with it. And I think using the carbon fibre, it's really light, there's no weight to it at all. I know you've got a little bit of metal work at either end, but you know, it's a lot lighter than say a steel, and even a lot lighter than a plastic snake. So that's great. Now the next job is to do the elevator, and I'm going to bring another control rod from this servo, and it actually comes out on the underside of the tail plane. If I just turn this over, and we can see there on the underside of the tail plane I've put in a little bit of sheeting where hopefully the control rod will come out and connect through. So I'm going to get on and do that now. And just one other point while I'm thinking about it, the fuselage, we've got this cross former here at the back of the cockpit, and you can see there's a fairly rough hole there, and I've just put that in with a diamond file. I love using these, they're great for putting holes in balsa or just making a hole bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'll probably make a hole in a piece of smaller balsa and just glue that over there, so we have one nice neat hole. But I'll see how it runs and how that needs neatening up. Right, I'll get on with this elevator now. Right, I've now put a little bit of balsa either side of where this carbon fibre rod enters the fuselage, and it's quite a nice fit. There's not much play there, but it's a smooth action. But because I've got this extender on here, this is actually 3mm, so what I've done is I've done a little bit of a hole there at that end where this will go through, and then it'll fit nice and smooth in there. Didn't want to make the whole slot 3mm, so you can just see what I've done there, just so I can get that in and then put it into place. Now, thinking about how I'm going to do the same thing down here, where the control rod is going to come out for the elevator, I've decided I don't think this sheeting is actually going to be a help. I think it's going to be more of a hindrance. So I'm going to cut it out. I'm going to set up the control rod, and then I will put in some bits of balsa exactly the same way as I've done here to close that down and hold the rod. I think that'll be far better than leaving this piece of sheeting here and trying to drill an acute angle. It's just not going to work. So I'll start doing that now. Right, well, I've now got both servos coupled up and they're working really nice and smooth. What I've done here with this rear servo is I've just lifted it up on a piece of 3mm ply, you can see here, and that is just to give more clearance of this servo arm on full extension, so that it's when it goes over the top of the receiver there. To be honest, there was room anyway, it was clearing it, but I just thought, well, it's easy to do and it just makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. Now, these control rods have got this threaded connector glued on either end, and what I need to do is put a nut either on one end or both ends here to tighten up against the clevis, just because if not they could start rotating and altering the trim. So these need to be nicely locked in. So just a simple 2mm nut on there will do that easily. So that's done now for the cockpit end, and if we take a look down at the tail end now, and we can see how that's operating. Right, well, now we've got these connected and we've got lots of movement there, plenty that we need as suggested by David Boddington in his build article. We've got adjustment on the control rods, We've got adjustment on the horns to give us larger throws if necessary. So I'm really pleased how this has worked out with these carbon fibre rods. There's no flex, no giving them, they just work really, really nice. And you can see here I took out that piece of sheeting and I've put in the just a bit of balsa down and made a slot like I did on that top surface, and that's worked really nice. So I would suggest doing it this way rather than putting it in and then trying to make the hole. Much better to make the hole after you know where the control rods are going. As I said, really pleased with how this has worked out, and I wasn't sure how it would work out, to be honest, when I started. We've got all of the electronics forward of the CG point, which is really going to help us when we find that balance or get the plane balanced finally. We've got these lovely light carbon fibre control rods rather than using steel, or even plastic snakes are quite heavy, so that's kept that light particularly down at the tail end, and they've worked out really positive. There's no flex or give in them, which is great, and you can see them working really nice and smoothly and really quite positively. I am genuinely pleased with how this has worked out. So I think what have we got to do next? Well, and this is going to be in the next video, I'm going to take out the electronics now, and if you remember, the tail comes off, and there's a few things to get finished on this plane before we can start covering. We've got the sheeting to do here, which I'd left. We've got around the nose just to profile and to alter a little bit. We've got the engine to fit. I hadn't thought about that. We've got the fuel proofing to do, we've got the engine to fit, and I think there's 2 degrees right thrust. And what else? There's just a few little things to get done anyway, and that's going to be the focus of the next video. So I'm going to draw this video to a close, and I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting and useful, and please come back and see how we get on finishing off this fuselage and getting it ready for covering. So thanks very much for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this build of this lovely vintage Tomboy Senior.